There are places in this world that seem untouched by time. Places so quiet, so safe, that danger feels like a story whispered from somewhere far away. Willow Creek, Alabama was one of those places. A small southern town wrapped in pine forests and brushed by slow-moving rivers. A place where summers hummed with cicadas and children's laughter drifted down dirt roads as barbecue smoke rose from porches. Where neighbors greeted each other by name, doors were rarely locked, and Friday night football was the loudest sound anyone ever heard. It was the kind of town where bad things were believed to happen somewhere else. But one summer evening in August 2005, that illusion shattered. A 10-year-old girl named Emily Grace Carter vanished while riding her pink bicycle down Maplewood Forest Road, just a few minutes from home. Her disappearance would ignite one of the most haunting mysteries in Alabama's history. It would turn Willow Creek from a quiet haven into a town gripped by fear, suspicion, and unanswered questions that would linger for nearly 2 decades. What happened to Emily Grace Carter on that warm August evening? And how could a child disappear without a trace in a town where everyone knew everyone? If you want to uncover the chilling answers to these questions, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Unscripted Tales, and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next chapter of this cold case story. Tell us in the comments from which city you are watching this episode, and let us reach 5,000 likes to bring you more stories of truth, loss, and justice. Now, let us go back to the summer of 2005, when Willow Creek still believed it was untouchable. The air was heavy with heat and the scent of blooming magnolia. Children chased fireflies as the sky turned gold. On Maplewood Forest Road, the shadows stretched long beneath the tall pines, and the sound of a bicycle bell echoed softly through the evening stillness. Emily Grace Carter was 10 years old, full of imagination, with golden hair tied in a pink ribbon that fluttered behind her as she rode. Her pink bicycle rattled with pencils, crayons, and folded sketches of oak trees and rivers. She had spent the afternoon at her best friend Katie Miller's house, giggling over dress-up games and melting popsicles. When the sun began to sink, she waved goodbye, promising to meet again in a few days. It was a short ride home, barely 5 minutes. But somewhere between Katie's porch and her own front door, Emily disappeared. As the streetlights flickered on and the first evening breeze stirred through the trees, her mother Laura stood on the porch, watching the road that curved into the forest. She waited for the flash of pink bicycle handles to appear from the shadows. But they never did. The calm of Willow Creek was about to break, and the nightmare was only beginning. The Carter family was known in Willow Creek for their warmth and closeness. Michael Carter worked at the local hardware store, a man with strong hands and a soft voice who always came home smelling faintly of sawdust and river water. He spent weekends fishing at the Tallapoosa River, often bringing his son Daniel along. Laura Carter, his wife, had left her job at the county office years ago to care for their 2 children. She was thoughtful, quiet, and protective, the kind of mother who packed extra snacks in lunch boxes and always kissed scraped knees twice for luck. Their oldest, Daniel, was 14, caught somewhere between boyhood and manhood. He teased his little sister endlessly but never let anyone else do the same. And then there was Emily, 10 years old, bright as a summer morning, with golden hair tied in a pink ribbon. She carried her sketchbook everywhere, its pages filled with drawings of oak trees, rivers, and her family smiling together. Her pink bicycle, a birthday gift from her father, had become her freedom. She would ride it through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, the basket rattling with crayons and dreams. Everyone in town knew the sight of her pedaling past, waving as she went. That August day had started like any other. The sun was high, the air thick with heat, and cicadas buzzed through the trees. Emily spent the afternoon at her best friend Katie Miller's house just a few blocks away. They played dress-up, shared popsicles that dripped down their hands, and giggled about who they would be when they grew up. When the sky turned orange and the shadows stretched long, Emily said goodbye, promising to see Katie soon. She hopped onto her pink bicycle, her ribbon fluttering behind her, and began pedaling down Maplewood Forest Road. It was a short ride home. 5 minutes, maybe less. The kind of distance every parent in Willow Creek thought was safe. But as the sun disappeared beyond the pines, Laura Carter began to feel something she could not explain. She stood on the porch watching the road, expecting at any moment to see the flash of pink handlebars coming out of the twilight. Minutes passed, then more. Inside, Michael set the table and Daniel lounged on the couch, half watching television. When Laura asked if either of them had seen Emily, her voice trembled ever so slightly. Michael smiled, trying to calm her. He told her not to worry, that Emily probably stopped to talk to a neighbor or draw something along the way. But as the minutes turned to an hour, that easy confidence began to fade. Michael grabbed his flashlight and walked down the street, calling her name. Neighbors joined in, stepping out onto porches, scanning yards, shaking their heads. No one had seen her. The streetlights flickered to life, casting pale light over the empty road. Laura's heart pounded as she picked up the phone and called the police. Her voice cracked as she tried to speak. Emily was missing. That night, the sound of Emily's name echoed through the trees. Michael's flashlight cut across fields and ditches. Daniel followed behind, calling out until his throat burned. The once peaceful town of Willow Creek grew quiet again, but not with comfort. This time it was the heavy kind of silence that hides fear in every shadow. Something was terribly wrong. And before the sun rose again, the search for Emily Grace Carter would consume the entire town, somewhere beyond the edge of those dark woods. The first clue was waiting. The first patrol car arrived at the Carter home just after 9 that night. Blue lights flashed softly against the white picket fence as officers stepped out, calm but cautious. In towns like Willow Creek, missing child reports were rare. The lead officer, trying to steady Laura's trembling voice, assured her that it was probably nothing serious. Maybe Emily had stopped at a friend's house. Maybe she had lost track of time. "It happens," he said gently. "Children wander." But Laura shook her head, clutching Emily's small sketchbook against her chest. Emily never wandered. She always came home when she promised. The officers spread out, flashlights sweeping across the yards through bushes and ditches. Michael followed them down the road, calling her name into the night air that now felt too still, too heavy. The beam of his light cut through the shadows of the pine trees that lined Maplewood Forest Road, each step echoing with dread. Behind him, Daniel trailed in silence, his hands shaking, his young voice cracking as he shouted her name again and again. Neighbors began to appear one by one. Some brought their own flashlights, others just stood on porches with arms folded, their faces pale with worry. The hum of crickets was broken only by the calls that filled the night. Emily's name carried across the fields, bouncing off the trees, returning with no answer. Dogs barked in the distance. Somewhere a screen door creaked open and then slammed shut. Inside the Carter home, Laura walked slowly through the living room, into Emily's small bedroom. On the desk sat her sketchbook, half open, a few pages filled with unfinished drawings of trees and rivers. Her colored pencils were scattered beside it, one broken clean in half. Laura sank onto the edge of the bed and pressed her hand to the pillow. The house felt wrong. Too quiet, too cold. She whispered her daughter's name into the silence, as if the walls themselves could answer her. Outside, Michael's flashlight caught every glint of reflection, a soda can, a shard of glass, a crushed leaf. Each time his heart leapt, only to fall again. Hours passed. Midnight came. The air grew colder, and fear spread through the town like a chill wind. The once peaceful streets of Willow Creek had become a maze of searching lights and whispered prayers. By now, every shadow seemed suspicious. Every rustle in the woods made hearts pound. Laura stood on the porch, watching the distant glow of flashlights flicker through the trees, her hands clasped together so tightly they had turned white. Still no sign of Emily, no pink bicycle, no ribbon, no voice calling back through the night. And as the clock crept past midnight, an uneasy truth settled over Willow Creek. Emily Grace Carter had vanished. But when the sun rose the next morning, something bright in the woods would catch a neighbor's eye, and everything would change. The sun rose over Willow Creek with a stillness that felt cruel. The world carried on as if nothing had changed. Birds sang. Cicadas buzzed. But inside the Carter home, time had stopped. Laura had not slept. Her eyes were swollen, her hands trembling around a mug of untouched coffee. Michael sat at the table, his face pale, his flashlight still beside him from the night before. Daniel sat quietly, his head resting on his arms, refusing to look up. The sound of car doors outside broke the silence. More officers had arrived, and with them came volunteers ready to search the woods and fields beyond Maplewood Forest Road. Among them was Angela Hughes, one of the Carters' neighbors, a kind woman who had often watched Emily playing outside after school. Angela joined a small group combing through the tall grass along the edge of the forest. The morning air was thick, heavy with dew, and the faint smell of pine hung over everything. She moved slowly, scanning the ground for anything that might lead them to the little girl with the golden hair. Then something bright caught her eye. A flash of pink among the green. Her breath caught. She stepped closer, her heart pounding as she brushed away the grass. There it was, Emily's pink bicycle. Upright, balanced awkwardly as if it had been left in a hurry. The basket was still attached. Inside it lay a folded piece of paper and a small crayon stub. The paper was one of Emily's sketches, half finished, a drawing of a tree with a bird perched on a branch. Angela felt her knees weaken as she whispered a trembling prayer. She called out for the others, her voice breaking. Officers rushed to the scene, taping off the area. They moved carefully, eyes scanning the ground. Just a few feet away, faint tire marks cut through the dirt, too wide for a bicycle. Nearby, the grass was bent and broken as if someone had struggled there. There was no blood. No footprints clear enough to trace, but the signs were unmistakable. Something had happened here. When Michael arrived, he saw the bicycle before he even stepped out of the car. His breath hitched, and for a moment he could not move. He walked toward it slowly, each step heavier than the last. When he finally reached it, his legs gave out. He sank to the ground, his hands gripping the handlebars as if holding them could somehow bring Emily back. Laura arrived moments later. The moment her eyes fell on the pink bicycle, a sound escaped her that no one in Willow Creek would ever forget. A cry so raw it seemed to cut through the air itself. She ran forward, clutching the ribbon tangled around the handlebar. It was the same ribbon she had tied in Emily's hair the day before. Officers gently tried to move her back to preserve the evidence, but she pressed the ribbon to her chest and sobbed until her voice was gone. Daniel stood at a distance, frozen, tears streaking his face. He had always thought himself too old to cry, but now all he could feel was guilt. He whispered to himself over and over that he should have walked her home. News of the discovery spread through town within an hour. Neighbors gathered quietly near the forest road, whispering prayers, holding their children close. The pink bicycle had become more than a child's toy. It was a symbol of dread. The innocence of Willow Creek was gone. Deputy Mark Rivers gave the order to collect every piece of evidence. The sketch from the basket was sealed carefully in a bag, its unfinished lines a haunting reminder of what had been lost. Officers took photographs of the trampled grass, the tire marks, the ribbon fluttering gently in the breeze. Every detail mattered now. As the police worked, Laura sat in the grass, her eyes locked on the empty road beyond the trees. Michael stood beside her, silent, his jaw clenched. They both knew this was no longer a case of a little girl wandering off. Something darker had entered their quiet town, and deep in those woods, hidden beyond the sunlight, something else was waiting to be found. The morning after Emily's pink bicycle was found, Willow Creek was no longer the same town. Fear had seeped into every home like a shadow that refused to lift. The roads that once echoed with the laughter of children were now filled with search teams, police cars and volunteers carrying flashlights and maps. The air buzzed with radio chatter, the barking of dogs and the heavy footsteps of men and women who refused to give up hope. Deputy Mark Rivers stood at the center of it all. A man in his 40s with tired eyes but a steady voice. He had taken charge of the search. He promised the Carters that he would find Emily, though deep down he feared what they might find first. He gathered everyone near the edge of Maplewood Forest Road, pointing toward the thick woods that stretched beyond the bicycle's discovery site. His tone was calm but firm as he divided volunteers into groups. Some were to sweep through the trees in wide lines, others were sent toward the riverbanks, and another team was assigned to check abandoned sheds and barns across town. Canine units were brought in, their handlers kneeling as the dogs sniffed the ribbon from Emily's bicycle. The animals barked sharply, catching a faint scent and pulling toward the forest. Hope surged for a moment. Dozens followed as the dogs darted between trees, their noses pressed low to the ground. The trail continued for several yards before it stopped abruptly near a patch of dirt, streaked with tire marks. The dogs whined and circled but could not move forward. The officers looked at one another. That was where the scent vanished. Deputy Rivers crouched near the tracks, running his hand across the soil. The faint smell of oil clung to the ground, fresh enough to suggest that a vehicle had been there not long ago. He looked toward the woods, his jaw tightening. This was no accident, no child lost in the trees. Someone had taken Emily. Back at the Carter home, Laura stood on the porch, surrounded by neighbors who brought water, blankets, and prayers. Her hands clutched Emily's sketchbook, the one left open on the desk. On its last page, the unfinished drawing of a tree and a bird seemed to haunt her. It was the same sketch found folded in the bicycle's basket. She stared at it as if willing it to give her a clue, a sign, anything that could lead them to her daughter. Reporters had begun to arrive from nearby towns, their vans parked along the street. Cameras pointed toward the Carter home as Laura stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. She begged whoever had her little girl to please let her come home. Her words were simple, broken, and real. The crowd around her fell silent, and for a brief moment even the cameras lowered. By afternoon, the search stretched far beyond Willow Creek. Boats were sent along the slow brown waters of the river, their motors cutting through the stillness. Volunteers in orange vests leaned over the sides, peering into the reeds and shallows. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping across the trees as though light alone could uncover the truth. Everywhere people searched, calling Emily's name into the air that grew hotter by the hour. Each time a shout echoed back, hearts lifted only to fall again when it was just another volunteer responding. The longer the day stretched, the heavier the silence became. By evening, exhaustion settled in. Faces were streaked with sweat and dirt, voices hoarse from calling. The pink bicycle sat behind the police tape, its ribbon fluttering softly in the wind, the last trace of a little girl who had simply vanished. And as the sun dipped below the trees, a quiet realization began to spread across Willow Creek. Whatever had taken Emily Grace Carter was still out there, watching. The first week after Emily's disappearance felt endless. The whole town of Willow Creek had turned into a search ground. Strangers who had never spoken before now stood side by side, calling her name through the fields and woods. The flashing lights of patrol cars glowed late into the night, and the sound of helicopters overhead became a part of the air itself. But for every hour that passed, hope began to thin. By the third day, reports began to pour in. A truck driver claimed he had heard a scream along the highway that same evening. Officers rushed to check the area, combing the roadside ditches and the thick brush beyond it. They found nothing but wind and darkness. Later, a woman reported seeing a dark-colored van parked near Maplewood Forest Road around sunset. For a moment, that lead sent waves of energy through the investigation. The van was found, belonging to a family visiting relatives in the next town over. They had left before Emily disappeared. Another call came from a man who swore his dogs had been barking wildly near the river that night. Officers searched for hours, their flashlights slicing through the mist that clung to the water. Again, nothing. Each lead that began with hope ended in silence. The police chased them all, desperate for even a small piece of truth, but the pattern never changed. A spark of promise followed by a dead end. By the end of the week, exhaustion had settled into every face. Deputy Mark Rivers stood inside the temporary command post at the local church, staring at the large map pinned to the wall. Red pins marked the places they had searched. There were hundreds now. Every road, every field, every inch of the forest. Yet the center of the map, the point where Emily had last been seen, stared back at him like an open wound. Meanwhile, the community tried to hold on to faith. Each evening, people gathered in the town square, candles in hand, their voices soft as they prayed for Emily's safe return. The church opened its doors around the clock, offering food, rest, and comfort to volunteers. Hymns echoed through the night air, but even the songs sounded hollow. Parents held their children tighter. Strangers hugged each other without a word. Laura attended every vigil, standing silently with Emily's sketchbook pressed to her heart. Michael spent his nights out with the search teams, his flashlight beam trembling from the weight of sleeplessness. Daniel, young and restless, joined the volunteers too, refusing to stay behind. He walked through mud and thorns, whispering his sister's name into the dark, hoping that somehow she might answer. But as days passed, fear began to twist into something else. Something colder. Whispers spread about strangers passing through town, about the possibility that someone among them had done this. Parents who had once trusted every neighbor now watched the streets through closed curtains. The laughter that had once defined Willow Creek was gone, replaced by hushed voices and suspicion. The story of Emily Grace Carter was no longer just about a missing child. It had become a shadow that stretched over everyone. People no longer asked where she was. They began to wonder who could have taken her, and soon that question would turn the town's suspicion inward, toward its own people. By the end of that long, hopeless week, Willow Creek was no longer just frightened. It was divided. Fear had turned neighbors into strangers, and whispers into weapons. People still showed up to search, but now they also looked at one another differently. The question that lingered in every quiet conversation was no longer what happened to Emily Grace Carter, but who among them could have done it. Inside the sheriff's office, the Carters were questioned again, this time in more detail. Deputy Mark Rivers handled it himself, careful, patient, taking notes on every word. Michael's alibi was checked first. He had been at the hardware store until closing, confirmed by both co-workers and security footage. Laura had been home all evening, neighbors remembering seeing her watering the front garden around sunset. And Daniel, though only 14, had an alibi too. He had been at home playing video games with a friend who came forward immediately. The Carters were cleared. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that their grief was real, but with the family ruled out, suspicion had to go somewhere. And that was when the whispers began. The first name that surfaced was Rick Holey, a handyman who lived alone in a rundown shack near Maplewood Forest Road, not far from where Emily's bicycle had been found. Rick was in his late 30s, a wiry man with sunken eyes and rough hands. He did odd jobs around town, fixing roofs, patching fences, but he was known for his temper and his drinking. Parents often warned their children not to go near his property. In a town like Willow Creek, that reputation was enough to make him an easy target. The police brought him in for questioning. His old rust-colored van was searched from front to back. The seats were torn, the floor littered with tools, wrappers, and oil stains. But there was no trace of Emily. No blood, no hair, no clothing, nothing. Rick grew angry, shouting that he was tired of being treated like a monster just because he lived alone. When he was released, he drove off, swearing he would leave Willow Creek behind. Still, for many, his anger only made him look guiltier. Another name floated through the gossip: Tommy Red Mitchell, a drifter who had been seen in town a few days before Emily vanished. He had a criminal record for theft and assault, and stories about him changed every time they were told. Some said they had seen him near the old gas station, others near the river. The police tracked him down, questioned him, and found that he had already moved on, heading south. He denied everything, but the timing left a shadow that refused to fade. Even people no one ever expected began to fall under suspicion. Sarah Dawson, Emily's teacher, had been close to the Carter family. Some said she had argued with Laura once about a school project. Others claimed she acted too nervous after the disappearance. None of it was true, but truth no longer mattered. Fear had a way of twisting every word, every look, every silence. By now, the air in Willow Creek felt different. The friendly greetings that once filled the streets had turned into cautious nods. Parents stopped letting their children play outside. Curtains stayed drawn even during the day. The town that once prided itself on trust had begun to choke on its own doubt. Deputy Rivers tried to calm everyone, reminding them that rumors would only make things worse. But he could see it in their faces. No one believed their town was safe anymore. And as the gossip spread like wildfire, what no one realized was that while they turned against one another, the real truth was slipping quietly out of reach. Winter came quietly to Willow Creek, but the chill it brought had nothing to do with the weather. 6 months had passed since Emily Grace Carter vanished, and the once constant noise of search parties had faded into silence. The volunteers who had once filled the woods with flashlights and hope had begun to return to their lives. The media vans that once lined the streets packed up their cameras and left for the next story. The posters that had once been bright with color now hung faded and torn on telephone poles, fluttering weakly in the wind. Inside the sheriff's office, the evidence board still stood, covered with photographs, maps, and red strings connecting theories that led nowhere. Deputy Mark Rivers sat at his desk late at night, staring at the pink bicycle in the evidence room through a small window. It had been months, and yet it still felt like that first night. The bicycle was no longer just a clue. It had become a symbol of failure. With every week that passed without answers, hope slipped further away. The case had slowed to a crawl. Every new lead turned into another dead end. Witnesses forgot details. Tips stopped coming in. By the time the first anniversary approached, the file was thick with reports but thin with truth. The words no one wanted to hear finally arrived. Cold case. For the Carter family, life no longer felt like life. It was survival. Michael had turned his grief into obsession. He began collecting everything: newspaper clippings, police reports, maps of Willow Creek, filling boxes that stacked high in the garage. He spent hours each night reading, rereading, and marking the same places on the map with a red pen, convinced that if he looked long enough, he would see something everyone else had missed. His co-workers at the hardware store whispered about how distracted he had become. Some days he did not speak at all. Laura withdrew from the world completely. She stopped answering the phone. She stopped visiting friends. Some days she sat for hours in Emily's room, brushing the bedspread and straightening the pink ribbon that still lay across the pillow. The sketchbook was open on the desk, its pages untouched since the day Emily disappeared. The last drawing, a tree with a bird on its branch, remained unfinished, frozen in time. Daniel changed too. Once playful and loud, he grew quiet and angry. He blamed himself, though no one ever said he should. He told himself over and over that he should have walked her home that night. He stopped hanging out with friends, skipped school more often, and spent hours alone by the river, throwing stones into the water just to hear something break the silence. Willow Creek itself had changed. The laughter that once echoed through its streets was gone. Parents no longer let their children ride bikes after sunset. The sound of a siren, once rare, now sent shivers through the town. Neighbors still waved, but their smiles never reached their eyes. The trust that once bound the town together had been replaced by quiet caution. At the church, the vigils grew smaller. Where hundreds had once gathered with candles, only a few dozen now came. Their prayers were softer, their faces tired. Some still believed Emily might return. Others no longer said her name aloud. 1 year after that August night, the sheriff's office announced what everyone had feared. The search for Emily Grace Carter had been suspended until new evidence appeared. The headline in the local paper was brief, but it cut deep. Missing girl's case goes cold. That night, Laura lit a single candle in Emily's bedroom window, the same window her daughter had once sat beside to draw. The tiny flame flickered against the glass, glowing faintly in the darkness, and though the town had fallen silent, that light burned on. Waiting. Somewhere beyond the edge of Willow Creek, the truth still slept, buried but not gone. Time moved on in Willow Creek, but the memory of Emily Grace Carter never truly left. What began as a desperate search slowly turned into a quiet ache that the town carried in silence. The posters that once covered every pole and shop window began to fade. Rain washed away the ink, the edges curled, and one by one they disappeared until only a few remained. Weathered, ghost-like reminders of a little girl who had once smiled from those pages. Each passing year dulled the urgency but not the sorrow. The annual vigils in the town square grew smaller. At first hundreds came, candles flickering in the night, voices praying for a miracle. But by the 5th year, only a few close friends and family stood in that circle. By the 10th, just the Carters, the pastor, and a handful of neighbors. The world had moved forward, but for the Carters, time had stopped in 2005. The police reopened the case twice, first in 2010, then again in 2015. Each time there was a spark of hope, a new lead, a new technology, a new possibility. Old evidence was re-examined, DNA samples were sent to better labs, and witnesses were re-interviewed. But every time the results came back the same. Inconclusive. The truth remained buried somewhere just out of reach. For Laura Carter, the years were heavy. Her spirit dimmed. She rarely left the house, spending her days in the quiet of Emily's room. She dusted the shelves, straightened the blankets, and kept the pink ribbon folded neatly across the pillow. Sometimes she would sit on the bed, holding Emily's sketchbook in her lap, tracing the drawings with her fingertips. She spoke softly to the empty room, her voice filled with a hope that was almost gone. Michael's grief turned into something darker, an obsession that consumed every part of him. He left his job at the hardware store after a breakdown, unable to focus on anything but the case. He filled their garage with boxes stacked to the ceiling, each one labeled with dates, articles, and police reports. Maps of Willow Creek covered the walls, red lines connecting points that only made sense to him. Late at night, a single light glowed from the garage window, and the neighbors knew he was in there, still searching, still hoping, still haunted. Daniel grew up under the weight of that silence. The guilt he carried as a boy never faded. By the time he was 17, he had stopped talking about his sister altogether. He left Willow Creek as soon as he finished high school, moving to another state for college. He rarely came home, not because he did not love his parents, but because every corner of that town held her memory. The road where her bicycle was found, the school where they had once walked together. Even the house itself felt frozen in time. Willow Creek tried to move on, but the shadow of Emily's disappearance lingered. Children who grew up after 2005 learned her story like a warning. Parents would whisper, "Stay close, do not wander, or you might end up like the Carter girl." Teenagers told ghost stories about hearing a bicycle bell at night near the woods, saying it was her spirit still searching for home. To outsiders, it sounded like folklore. To those who lived through it, it was a wound that had never healed. By 2020, 15 years had passed since that summer evening when a little girl vanished on her way home. The world had changed. Willow Creek had changed. But one truth remained the same. Emily Grace Carter had never been found. And yet that fall, deep in the woods near the Willow Creek River, something would surface. Something that had been hidden beneath the earth for 15 long years. It was a quiet September morning in 2020, when the silence of Willow Creek was finally broken. The air was cool, the leaves had just begun to turn, and for the first time in years, the forest along the Willow Creek River felt alive again. A local hunter named James Holey, A man who had spent decades walking those woods was out early with his dog. The river glimmered between the trees, and the forest floor was layered thick with fallen leaves. To him it was just another calm morning, until something unusual caught his eye. Near the roots of an old oak tree, something pink was peeking through the dirt. At first he thought it was trash, maybe an old tarp or a piece of clothing someone had dumped there. But as he brushed away the soil with his glove, his breath caught. The fabric was small, delicate, and faded, the color barely visible but still pink enough to be noticed. He leaned closer, and his hand struck something hard beneath the dirt. It was not wood. It was not stone. It was something else. A terrible realization crept over him. His heart began to pound as he stood back, frozen for a moment. Then, with shaking hands, he called the sheriff's office. Within the hour, the quiet riverbank had turned into a crime scene. Yellow tape surrounded the area, flashing lights reflected off the water, and the soft morning calm was replaced by the sharp voices of investigators moving with purpose. The excavation was slow, deliberate. Every inch of soil was lifted carefully, every fragment preserved. What they uncovered beneath the ground stopped everyone in their tracks. There, buried in a shallow grave, were the skeletal remains of a child. The bones were fragile, weathered by time, but still enough to tell a story. Next to the remains lay pieces of pink fabric, torn, faded, but unmistakably the same shade as the bicycle and ribbon found 15 years earlier. And beside the fabric, half buried in the dirt, was a small silver bracelet. It was tarnished and scratched, but the engraving was still visible. 3 letters shimmered faintly in the sunlight: EGC. When word reached the Carter family, it was as if the world stopped again. 15 years of hope, no matter how faint, collapsed in an instant. Laura dropped to her knees, unable to breathe. For years she had prayed for one thing, to know, and now she did. Michael stood beside her, his face pale, his hands shaking, as he held the bracelet that once belonged to their little girl. Daniel flew back from out of state. He walked into his childhood home in silence, past the photos, past the empty room, until he reached the desk where Emily's sketchbook still lay open. He traced his fingers along the page, the unfinished tree she had drawn so long ago. His voice broke as he whispered softly, "We found you, Em. We finally found you." The remains were taken to the state forensics lab. Weeks of analysis followed, and the results were confirmed. The dental records matched. The DNA was irrefutable. After 15 years, the name was finally spoken aloud again by investigators with certainty. Emily Grace Carter had been found. But the discovery brought not peace, only new pain. The autopsy revealed what the family had feared but never wanted to believe. The bones showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull and ribs. The shallow grave and the fragments of clothing told the rest. This was not an accident. This was murder. For Sheriff Mark Rivers, who had once been a deputy during the original investigation, the moment was heavy with emotion. He stood at the edge of the dig site, his hat in his hands, staring at the patch of earth where the child had been hidden for so long. His voice was low but firm as he spoke to his team. They had failed her once. They would not fail her again. That day, the case of Emily Grace Carter was reopened not as a mystery, but as a hunt for justice. And as the investigators began to examine the newly uncovered evidence, they would soon find that the truth had never been as far away as they believed. The discovery of Emily's remains reignited something that had long been buried, not only in the woods of Willow Creek, but in the hearts of everyone who had once searched for her. This time the investigation looked different. The old case files, once thick with frustration, were now paired with tools that did not exist back in 2005. Technology had changed. Science had evolved, and for the first time in 15 years, the truth seemed within reach. At the State Crime Lab in Montgomery, a team of forensic experts worked day and night. Every piece of evidence from the site, the pink fabric, the ribbon, the bracelet, and even the soil itself, was treated with delicate precision. Each fiber, each fragment was a possible key to unlocking what had happened that night. Under high-powered microscopes, the faded fabric revealed what the naked eye could never see. Embedded in the threads were traces of skin cells, microscopic, almost invisible, but still there after all those years. The same tests were run on Emily's ribbon, the one her mother had tied in her hair the day she vanished. For hours the machines hummed and beeped, and then finally a result appeared. It was faint, partial, but unmistakable. A strand of male DNA had been found. It was not enough for a direct match in CODIS, the national DNA database, but it was a beginning. The first real evidence of who might have touched Emily's clothing before she died. The lab sent the results to specialists trained in forensic genealogy, a new branch of science that had cracked hundreds of cold cases across the country. They began the painstaking process of uploading the profile into public genetic databases, cross-referencing thousands of family trees, searching for any possible connection that could lead back to the source. Weeks passed. Names appeared. Some were distant relatives, some too far removed to matter. But then, patterns began to form. Branches of a family line that connected to one particular surname. One that Willow Creek knew all too well, the Hole family. The investigators followed the threads carefully, tracing through generations of records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, old addresses, and as the family tree narrowed, one name kept rising to the surface, a man who had once been a suspect. A man who had lived just a mile from where Emily's bicycle was found. The man who had been there all along. The results were clear. Every genetic line pointed toward one connection. Rick Hole. And with that, the quiet woods of Willow Creek were about to echo with truth once again. Truth that had waited 15 long years to be uncovered. When the results from the forensic genealogy finally pointed toward the Hole family, Sheriff Mark Rivers felt the chill of recognition. The name brought back memories of late nights in the sheriff's office 15 years earlier. Nights filled with frustration, doubt, and unanswered questions. Rick Hole, the reclusive handyman who lived alone in a weathered shack near the edge of Maplewood Forest Road. The man who had once been questioned, suspected, and then quietly forgotten when no evidence could tie him to Emily's disappearance. But now, the science said otherwise. Every strand of DNA, every genetic thread, every trace pointed to him. This time, the sheriff would not rely on luck or assumptions. This time, they would do it right. The investigation began again, quietly and carefully. Hole had aged, now in his early 50s, but he had not changed much. He still lived in the same decaying cabin near the woods, still worked odd jobs fixing engines and repairing fences, still kept to himself. Neighbors described him the same way they always had, quiet, strange, someone you did not make small talk with. A surveillance team was assigned to watch him around the clock. They followed him as he moved through his routine, stopping for gas, picking up groceries, sitting alone at the bar that overlooked the old highway. He never spoke much, never lingered long, but he left behind something far more valuable than words. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Hole sat outside a convenience store drinking coffee from a paper cup. When he finished, he tossed the cup into a nearby trash bin and drove away. Within minutes, an officer retrieved it, sealed it in an evidence bag, and sent it to the lab. Days later, the results came back. The DNA from that discarded cup matched perfectly with the sample recovered from Emily's ribbon and dress. After 15 years of waiting, the proof was undeniable. The man who had lived less than a mile from where Emily's bicycle was found had left his mark on her clothing the night she disappeared. When Sheriff Rivers received the confirmation, he sat in silence for a long moment. After years of searching, the case that had haunted him was finally unfolding before his eyes. But the district attorney reminded him, DNA alone would not be enough. They needed motive. They needed witnesses. They needed to close every gap that a defense could exploit. The team began digging through every record, every statement from 2005. They revisited Jole's old alibi, the one that claimed he was at the Rusty Nail Bar that evening. They found that the bartender who had vouched for him could no longer remember the exact timeline. Patrons admitted they were drinking heavily that night, unsure of when Jole had come or gone. Slowly the holes began to show. 15 years ago they had been chasing shadows, but now the shadow had a face. The truth was finally taking shape, and soon, that truth would walk into the light, no matter how dark it was. By the time the year 2022 arrived, the pieces of the puzzle that had haunted Willow Creek for nearly 2 decades were finally beginning to align. The DNA had spoken, the science had confirmed it. But Sheriff Mark Rivers knew that to bring justice for Emily Grace Carter, they needed more than cold evidence. They needed the story that the evidence could not tell, the missing pieces of that August night. Investigators began revisiting every name, every face connected to the case. They went back to the Rusty Nail Bar, where Rick Jole had claimed to be the evening Emily disappeared. The bartender who had once sworn that Rick was there the whole time now hesitated. His memory was blurred by the years and by the drinks that had flowed that night. Under careful questioning, he admitted something that changed everything. There had been an hour, maybe more, when he did not see Rick at all. An empty space in the timeline. The same hour when Emily vanished. That revelation reopened a floodgate of details. Other patrons from that night were tracked down, some in nearby towns, others hundreds of miles away. Their memories were faint, but a few recalled the same thing. Rick had come in late, left suddenly, and returned looking tense and distracted. The missing hour that had once been buried under years of confusion now stood out like a flashing light. Then came the breakthrough that sealed it. Detectives found Rick's former girlfriend, a woman who had moved out of state years ago and wanted nothing to do with Willow Creek anymore. When she was told about the new DNA evidence, she hesitated, her voice trembling. Then slowly, she recounted something she had never told anyone before. She remembered the night she and Rick had been watching the news years earlier, when the search for Emily was still on every channel. The screen had shown the little girl's photo, her bright smile, her golden hair. Rick had watched for a long moment, then smirked and muttered that the police were wasting their time. He had said that the girl was gone for good, and that nobody was smart enough to find her. Those words, spoken so casually back then, now carried a terrible weight. When investigators compared that statement with the new forensic proof, there was no doubt left. The evidence was complete. The story had come full circle. On a gray November morning, a convoy of police vehicles pulled quietly down Maplewood Forest Road. Birds scattered from the trees as officers surrounded the sagging wooden shack at the end of the lane. Rick Jole stepped out onto his porch, a cigarette dangling from his lips, unaware that his freedom was seconds away from ending. Sheriff Rivers approached slowly, his voice steady but firm. "Rick Jole, you are under arrest for the murder of Emily Grace Carter." Rick froze, his eyes darting from one officer to another. He started shouting, swearing that he had nothing to do with it. But the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, and for the first time, he had nowhere left to hide. As word of the arrest spread through Willow Creek, the town that had lived under a shadow for 17 years fell silent. People stood in disbelief, some in shock, others in tears. They had walked past this man in grocery stores, seen him fixing fences, nodded at him on quiet mornings, never knowing the truth that lingered behind his eyes. For the Carter family, the news brought a flood of emotion, grief, rage, relief, and exhaustion all tangled together. Laura wept into Michael's shoulder, whispering that Emily finally had a voice again. Daniel stood in silence, staring at the news broadcast on the television, his jaw set with quiet fury. After nearly 2 decades of fear and doubt, the face of their daughter's killer had finally been unmasked. But for Willow Creek, the story was far from over, because the courtroom would soon reveal everything that had been hidden in the shadows. The spring of 2023 brought attention to Willow Creek that had not been felt in years. The courthouse, usually quiet and forgotten, was now the heart of the town once more. Reporters filled the steps, their cameras pointed toward the doors where the man accused of taking Emily Grace Carter's life would soon walk in chains. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Every seat was taken, every hallway filled with murmurs. People who had once searched the woods, who had prayed under candlelight vigils, who had feared walking down Maplewood Forest Road, they were all there. The Carters sat in the front row side by side, holding each other's hands. Laura clutched Emily's small sketchbook against her chest, the same one that had sat untouched for years. Michael sat stiffly beside her, his eyes fixed on the empty defense chair. Daniel, now a grown man, sat behind them, silent but unflinching. When the doors opened and Rick Holay entered in his orange prison uniform, the room fell into a suffocating quiet. His hair had turned gray, his shoulders heavier with age, but his eyes, unsharp and cold, had not changed. He scanned the room once, then looked away. The prosecution began their case with calm precision. District Attorney Claire Jennings stood before the jury and told them that this case was not just about science. It was about a promise to a little girl who never came home. She walked them through the evidence step by step, building the story that had taken nearly 2 decades to complete. She explained the DNA match in detail, how modern technology had traced microscopic skin cells from Emily's ribbon and dress to Rick's discarded coffee cup. The jury listened as forensic experts testified about genealogy mapping, about how the threads of bloodlines had led investigators straight to the Holay family, and finally to Rick himself. Then came the timeline. Jennings circled the missing hour, the gap in Rick's bar alibi that no one could account for. She reminded the jury that this was the same window when Emily vanished. Witness after witness came forward, each piece fitting perfectly into place. The courtroom grew still when Rick's former girlfriend took the stand. Her voice trembled as she recounted his cruel words years ago, that the police would never find that little girl because she was gone for good. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Laura pressed a shaking hand over her mouth. Daniel's fists clenched tight. Finally, Sheriff Mark Rivers was called. His voice carried both strength and grief as he spoke about the long years of searching, the sleepless nights, and the moment they found Emily's remains beneath the oak tree by the river. He looked toward the Carters and said softly that he had made them a promise, and he had kept it. The prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. The silver bracelet engraved with EGC was displayed before the jury, its surface tarnished but still shining under the lights. The unfinished drawing from Emily's sketchbook was shown too, a simple tree frozen forever halfway done. These small things, once ordinary, now carried the weight of a child's stolen life, but the defense fought hard. Rick's lawyer, Robert Greer, argued that the DNA evidence could have been contaminated. He told the jury that genealogy was new, uncertain, untested. He reminded them there were no eyewitnesses, no confession, no weapon. He asked them to consider whether it was fair to destroy a man's life based on science taken from the dirt after 15 years. Rick himself sat motionless, his expression unreadable. Sometimes he leaned close to whisper to his lawyer. Sometimes he stared at the Carters, his gaze cold and defiant. He never once spoke aloud. Each day of the trial weighed heavier than the last. The air in the courtroom felt thick, every pause stretching long, every word cutting deep. Reporters filled their notebooks, capturing the pain etched across every face. When the final day of testimony ended, District Attorney Jennings stood once more before the jury. Her voice was steady as she said that Emily Grace Carter had been silenced once, but now her story had been told. The science did not lie. The truth had waited 18 years to be heard. It was time to listen. The jury would soon decide whether the man sitting before them would spend the rest of his life behind bars. And when they returned with their verdict, the silence inside that courtroom would be unlike anything Willow Creek had ever heard before. The final day of the trial arrived with the kind of stillness that hangs before a storm. The courthouse in Willow Creek was silent from the outside, but inside every breath felt heavy. The jury had begun their deliberation early that morning. Hours passed slowly, the clock ticking loud in the quiet courtroom. The Carters sat together in the front row, hands intertwined, waiting for a moment they had dreamed of and dreaded all at once. It did not take long. Before the sun had even set, the bailiff stepped into the room and announced that the jury had reached a decision. People turned toward the doors as the jurors filed in one by one, their faces unreadable. Sheriff Rivers stood in the back, his hat in his hands. The room held its breath. The forewoman rose, a folded slip of paper trembling slightly in her hands. The judge asked for the verdict. Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of 18 years of pain. We, the jury, find the defendant, Rick Holay, guilty of murder in the first degree. The words echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. For a moment, no one moved. Then the emotion broke. Laura Carter's face crumpled as she buried her head in Michael's shoulder, her sobs quiet but deep. Michael wrapped his arms around her, eyes closed, his body shaking with the release of years of torment. Daniel sat behind them, tears streaming down his face, a mix of anger, grief, and relief all at once. Rick Holay did not flinch. His jaw tightened and his eyes burned with defiance as deputies stepped toward him. He muttered under his breath, his voice sharp with bitterness, claiming the town never wanted the truth. But the truth was already standing in front of him, and it had spoken. A week later, the courtroom filled again for sentencing. Reporters lined the walls. The Carters sat in the same seats they had occupied for every hearing, Emily's silver bracelet resting in Laura's hands. When the judge entered, the noise faded to silence. Rick Holay was brought in, wrists bound, head bowed, but his eyes still cold. The judge read through the charges once more before lifting his gaze to the man who had kept a town captive in fear for almost 2 decades. His words were measured but firm. You silenced a child, but her voice is heard again. You buried her, but you could not bury the truth. You will spend the rest of your life in prison and you will never walk free again. The sentence was clear. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As the gavel struck, the sound was final. For the first time in 18 years, Willow Creek exhaled. The man who had stolen a child's life would never see the light of freedom again. Outside the courthouse, the air was cool, and the crowd that had gathered stood in silence as the Carters faced the cameras. Michael spoke first, his voice tired but steady. He said they had waited 18 years for this day, and though Emily would never come home, she was not forgotten. Justice had been slow, but it had come. Laura stood beside him, holding Emily's sketchbook close. She opened to the unfinished drawing of a tree and whispered softly that this was where their daughter had left off, and this was where they would keep her memory alive. Behind them, the courthouse doors closed, and Rick Holay was led away to begin the life he had earned, a life behind bars. The crowd did not cheer. They simply watched, tears in their eyes as justice finally settled over Willow Creek like the first breath after a storm. But even as the town began to heal, one truth lingered quietly in every heart, that while justice had come, healing would take much longer. And for the Carter family, peace was still a fragile thing. When the courtroom lights dimmed and the cameras moved on, Willow Creek was left with a silence unlike any it had ever known. Justice had been served, but peace did not come easily. The people of the town tried to return to their ordinary lives, to the sound of children playing, to the hum of the river, to the warmth of Friday night football. Yet something had changed forever. The story of Emily Grace Carter had marked every heart, every street, every home. For the Carter family, life after the verdict was not about celebration. It was about survival. They had waited 18 long years for justice, and when it came, it felt both heavy and hollow. Michael spent most nights in the garage, sitting among the same stacks of case files and newspaper clippings, that had filled his world for nearly 2 decades. The papers were worn, the ink faded, but he could not throw them away. They were pieces of Emily's story, fragments of the years he had spent chasing the truth. Sometimes he would just sit in the dim light, running his hand over the boxes, whispering her name as though she might answer. Laura found her own way to keep their daughter close. She began attending church again, sitting in the same pew she had once sat in during those long years of prayer. Every Sunday she carried 2 things with her: Emily's pink ribbon and the small sketchbook filled with her drawings. The ribbon stayed tucked safely in her purse, and the sketchbook rested beside her as she listened to the hymns. To her, those simple things were not reminders of loss, but symbols of a love that could never be taken away. Daniel, now a man hardened by grief but guided by purpose, turned his pain into something larger. He began speaking at schools and community centers across Alabama, telling Emily's story not as a tale of tragedy, but as one of awareness, resilience, and hope. He spoke to students about safety, about courage, about never giving up. His voice trembled at times, but his message was clear, that no one should ever be forgotten the way his sister once was. And every time he finished speaking, he would hold up Emily's sketchbook and tell the crowd that she was the artist who had taught him how to see the world differently. In Willow Creek, something began to shift. The fear that had once ruled the town slowly gave way to quiet strength. The people came together one final time for a vigil, not one of sorrow but of remembrance. The town square glowed with hundreds of candles. Children placed flowers and handmade drawings at the foot of Emily's grave, pictures of pink bicycles, trees, and butterflies, the same images she had once loved to draw. As the candles flickered in the cool night air, Pastor Williams spoke softly to the crowd. He said that Emily's story had reminded Willow Creek of something precious, that even when darkness lingers, hope has a way of finding light. The people bowed their heads in silence. Some wept, some smiled, but all felt the same quiet unity that the town had lost so long ago. From that night on, Willow Creek was never quite the same, but perhaps that was the point. The town had learned that safety was not the absence of danger, but the presence of care, of vigilance, of love. At the edge of the cemetery, beneath the oak tree that swayed gently in the evening breeze, stood Emily's white headstone. Etched into the marble were the words that would forever define her story. Forever 10, forever remembered. And as the last candle flickered out, it felt as if her spirit still lingered there. Not as a ghost, but as a reminder that even after the longest silence, a voice can still be heard. 2 decades had passed since that warm August evening when a 10-year-old girl with golden hair disappeared on her way home. Willow Creek had changed, and so had the world around it. But one name, one story, one memory never faded: Emily Grace Carter. The case that had once broken a small Alabama town became a symbol far beyond its borders. Across the country, detectives and scientists studied it as a landmark in forensic genealogy, proof that time could no longer bury the truth. The discovery of a single strand of DNA had rewritten what was possible. Law enforcement agencies began reopening hundreds of old cases, driven by the same persistence that had finally brought justice to Willow Creek. Emily's name became more than a memory. It became a reason for others to keep fighting for those who had been lost. By the summer of 2025, the town gathered once again in the square, not in grief this time, but in remembrance. It had been 20 years since Emily's disappearance. The sun dipped low over the trees, painting the sky with the same colors that had once followed her pink bicycle down Maplewood Forest Road. Families filled the square, candles flickering in the warm evening breeze. A new mural had been painted on the wall of the town library, a beautiful tribute created by local artists and children who had grown up hearing her story. It showed a little girl riding her pink bicycle, her golden hair streaming behind her, heading toward a bright and endless sky. Below it were the words that had become part of Willow Creek's heart. Forever 10, forever remembered. Laura stood quietly before the mural, the pink ribbon held gently in her hand. Her eyes shimmered with tears, but there was peace in them now. Beside her, Michael placed a hand on her shoulder. He had finally packed away the old case files, not to forget, but to rest. For the first time in 20 years, he could breathe without the weight of unfinished promises. Daniel stood beside them, tall and calm, the man his sister would have been proud of. He had turned his pain into purpose, sharing Emily's story wherever he went. And now, as he looked up at her painted smile, he whispered softly, almost to himself, that she had never really left. She was here, in the hearts of everyone who refused to forget. As the candles were lit one by one, the crowd began to sing softly. The same hymn that had once filled the church years ago when hope was all they had. This time it was not a song of sorrow but of remembrance. The air felt lighter. The silence that had haunted Willow Creek for so long was finally gone, replaced by warmth, by love, by the quiet sound of peace. The Carters stood together, their hands intertwined, watching the mural glow in the candlelight. They had lost so much, but they had also reclaimed something precious, their daughter's voice. It no longer echoed through fear or grief, but through art, through memory, through justice. Emily Grace Carter had become more than the girl who never made it home. She had become the light that led an entire town out of darkness. Her story had begun with silence, but now that silence was filled with love. If you are still watching this story till now, it means it touched your heart. So my friends, this story truly deserves your like and your subscribe. Turn on the bell icon so you never miss stories like this. And please help me reach 5,000 likes, because that is the goal set by my mother, and I promised her we could do it together. Tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this cold case story tonight?